All right. Hello again, everyone. Okay, so our next speaker joins us from the University of Adelaide in Australia. Professor Matthew Roughan obtained his PhD in applied mathematics from the University of Adelaide in 1994. He has worked in various industry-related positions with Australian Defence, with Ericsson at the University of Melbourne, and at the AT&T Shannon Research Labs in the United States. His research interests range from stochastic modeling to measurement and management of networks, such as the internet. And in 2018, he was elected to be a fellow of the ACM, and in 2019, a fellow of the IEEE for his work on internet measurement. And he is a chief investigator in the ARC Center of Excellence for Mathematical and Statistical Frontiers. And he will be giving his paper on space in Pratchett's narrative networks. So with that, I turn you over to Matthew. Thank you.
Hi. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I've got at least one person who can hear me. Thanks for the introduction. It's an absolutely huge pleasure to be here. As you said, I'm in Adelaide in sunny Australia, or at least I would normally say sunny Australia, but it's the canonical dark and stormy night outside at the moment. It's great to be presenting here, but you probably guessed from the little read of my bio that this is not my normal gig. I come from a mathematics and a statistics and a computer science background, and my bread and butter is analyzing things like the internet. So this is a pretty different project for me. But I keep getting pulled in this direction, not least because I really agree with Pratchett's view that stories are important, and understanding stories can tell us a lot about ourselves. Quick warning, my talk, you can see the titles change. It's a little bit different from the talk I envisaged when I wrote my proposal. I haven't done everything I'd like to do, and I've done some other things as well, so it will be a little bit different. But I guess for you guys, actually, the whole style of the talk is going to be really, really different. I just can't do a talk as great as the last one, and so you'll have to put up with the sort of things that I do. But I do promise to go light on the mathematics. So the type of tool, the type of technique I'm going to talk about, it comes under different names, but perhaps one that you might have heard of is the idea of distant reading as opposed to close reading. The idea is that some corpora of text are just very, very large. And we see this in Pratchett's work, 41 novels, just the novels on the Discworld, something like 4 million words. We have another project going at the moment, which is looking at World War I diaries from Australian soldiers and nurses who fought in World War I. There we have something like 1,000 documents, more like 15 million words. We just can't read them all, or even if you could read them all, you can't hold them all in your mind all at once. You can't see the big picture. You get caught in minutiae. So in distant reading, we're applying techniques from computational or statistical or mathematical areas to gain large-scale insights on the works. It has some really good features. It's perhaps more objective because there's no human in the loop. But on the bad side, humans are really good at understanding, and algorithms, not perfect. So it's really a technique that's complementary with the more traditional close reading of literature. It's a way that we can perhaps answer some questions that are generated from that area, or vice versa, create questions that maybe can be answered by more close reading. Jumping right into the sort of tools that we're using, that generally come under the heading of natural language processing. This is a huge area, not just focused on understanding literature or history. It's being used in a vast array of applications these days. Machine learning, AI, these are sort of big buzzwords, and this is a big part of it. There are lots of subtopics that are sort of various pieces sort of that fall under here, quantitative linguistics or natural language understanding. There are lots of techniques that you could apply, sentiment analysis, topic modeling, and so on. I'm going to talk about a particular one today, which is related to finding the named entities in a document. Why am I doing that? Well, when you look at applications of natural language processing to fantasy and science fiction, there's almost nothing. There's a little bit of work analyzing some historical documents. There's a little bit of work looking at mythology, particularly the Icelandic sagas and Irish mythology, but fantasy and sci-fi often get neglected. They're often somehow seen as trivial, and I think that's really wrong. I think one of the things that's really interesting about those genres is they often involve a made-up world, and people find those worlds very compelling. But what is it about that constructed world that makes it so compelling? And the question I pose for this talk in particular is realism something that's important? And obviously, when we talk about realism, we don't mean the super realism. We obviously, in Pratchett's works, we have magic, for instance. But perhaps realistic in a statistical sense. And of course, I come from a math stats sort of background, so I care about numbers, I care about quantitative measures, so that's the sort of direction I'm going to go in. So let's think about the building blocks of a constructed world, or a real world for that matter. People, places, things. Also the relationships between them, and if I have time, I'll get to talk a little bit about relationships. We can break those down into a lot more sort of subcategories. Ordinary people, I put it in quotes because in Pratchett's works there are very few people who I would call ordinary, but also in fantasy we often see gods, devils, and so on, perhaps intelligent animals. When we talk about places, we're talking about both natural and man-made features. And then things, artifacts, languages, organizations, there's a lot of possibilities hidden in there. Collectively, we call these named entities, and we call them named entities because naively you might think of them as proper names, but actually there are a whole bunch of things in these categories that aren't really traditional proper names. For instance, a particular date. So let's get to the actual sort of story of the talk. When I started this work, I actually imagined the named entity recognition part of the work, the pulling those named entities out of a text, wouldn't be too hard. And the reason I imagine this is because this is a sort of area that's been around for a couple of decades. There's been a lot of research on it, hundreds and hundreds of papers, and there are at least two commonly used tools, Spatial and NLTK. They're both toolkits within the Python programming languages. And they bill themselves as being, world's best practice. They make it sound like they'll do it. They're all singing or dancing. So your first point of call for something like this is to try those tools on the problem. They were just terrible. And it's not fair to call them terrible because there are reasons why they work so badly. To understand that, you need to appreciate that a lot of this modern approach to natural language understanding uses AI, or more appropriately, it uses machine learning. So the approach is that you take a large labeled corpora, that is, the parts of speech in the corpora are labeled. In particular, in our case, the entities are noted. Typically, someone might have created this from a large set of newsprint and had a large number of people doing the labeling. They need this large data set to train the machine learning algorithm to do the analysis. The trouble is, the corpora that have been used in constructing these tools are not at all like and fantasy in more general. The most obvious examples of why they're different is that Pratchett's writing involves a lot of made-up words, both as proper names and as common nouns. I've got a couple of examples there. Rincewind's the obvious one for names. Octoroon's another great one in terms of common nouns. But there are lots of other reasons. There are lots of other idiosyncrasies of fantasy writing and of Terry Pratchett in particular, which make this task much harder on his corpora. So one of the ways I could have approached this project is to construct a new labeled corpora of Pratchett work or fantasy work, and then applied Spacey or applied the NLTK to that corpora. But to be honest, that didn't seem like very much fun. So instead, I rolled my own. It's implemented in a cool new programming language called Julia. I guess that most people here won't have heard of it or won't care about it, but it's got a lot of really beautiful features. To a geek like me, it's really, really appealing. And I adopted a really old-fashioned approach to identifying names in text, which uses the structure of the text rather than a blind machine learning algorithm. If you care, the goal is to get greater than 95% of classifications correct. And I'm at that point with 5 books. I wanted to be a lot further along by the time I gave this talk, but writing your own code and building this all from scratch, it takes a lot of time. And in the current environment, it's been hard to get quite as much time as I'd like. So 5 is good, and you'll notice that there are the first 4 books in the Discworld sequence, and then a big jump up to making money. So, as you do, you start from the first few books, but then I also wanted to see some of the contrast between those early books and some of his later writing. So I jumped ahead. Some quick numbers to describe them. I have a quick little table here. Mentions refers to the number of named entities that are mentioned in the text, or say more correctly, the number of mentions of a named entity. So for instance, in The Color of Magic, a named entity is mentioned 2,474 times. The number of persons is the number of entities which happen to be a person, including things like gods and death, for instance. Then there are locations and artifacts. And in fact, there are other categories that I haven't shown here that have a much smaller impact. What do you notice about these numbers just to just leap out at you? Well, firstly, The Color of Magic stands out in terms of having a large number of locations. And I don't think anyone will find this surprising. The Color of Magic, firstly, it's written almost like a travel log. They go to a series of places. So it's not surprising there are a lot of places mentioned, but also it's Pratchett's first book in the Discworld, and he's introducing the world to us. He's teaching us about the world through the eyes, particularly of this tourist, Two-Flower. As he progresses, he doesn't need to do that so much. And so the number of locations he's describing or talking about focuses down on the story arc that he's interested in. What else do we notice? Well, you notice in terms of numbers of mentions, Making Money has almost twice as many as the others. That shouldn't be a big surprise. It's a much bigger book. We're talking about jumping from a bit more than 200 pages up to more than 400 pages of novel. So again, it's not surprising it's bigger. And you notice, though, that there are a lot more people talked about in this book. And I want to get to that in a little bit more detail. But first, I want to just say these numbers are very fragile. So you may not care about that, but the problem with fragile numbers is we can't say very much solid based on them because they can be very easily distorted. So for instance, if Pratchett had wanted to change one of these numbers, it would have been very easy to just add one sentence into any one of these novels and talk about half a dozen random names that we never see again, ever again. And he could have bumped any of these numbers up by a significant amount. So one of the things we've been doing in our research is trying to look at ways of robustly measuring stories. And in particular, we have a technique for measuring the number of characters, which is based on an ecological idea. I won't go into the details here, but there's a little link to the paper at the top. And when we use that metric, we see the same trend, but now we're a little bit more confident about it. The trend starts with significant cast in The Color of Magic, and this again happens because he visits several different areas over the course of the story, and then it decreases. And I think one of the things we're seeing with Pratchett's writing here is that as he gets into equal rights and morts, he's actually hitting his stride and he's concentrating on the story arc. He's not needing to bring a whole lot of extraneous details in. He's just telling us a nice yarn. Of course, by the time we get up to making money, suddenly the number of cast members has blown out again. And I think we're seeing the reverse effect here, which is that apart from his writing having matured, he's now writing in his stories in an entire fully fleshed world. And so one of the things I want to do is try and see if that's really true, if it's really true that that world is starting now to be more like the real world. Nope, screen seems to have frozen for a sec there. Here's another view of the same set of data. So this is the color of magic. Along the x-axis here, we're seeing time as measured by the sentence number in different characters, and each dot indicates a mention in the story. So not surprisingly, you see Rincewind and Twoflower being mentioned all the way through the story. They're the protagonists. The luggage comes up often through the story. One of the things this highlights perhaps though is that there's a little bit of a dead patch towards the end where the luggage doesn't seem to be being mentioned, and that's because it's being alluded to. There are lots of mentions of a sea monster, which is the luggage, but it's not referred to by name, and it's very hard for an algorithm to extract mentions that are not really a name. What else do we see? Apart from that, thrust of those characters going all the way through the story, one of the other things that we see really strongly here is the episodic nature of the story, of the books. Color of Magic is really a book in 4 parts, almost like 4 little novellas. The first set in Ankh-Morpork, the second in A Temple in the Forest, the third in Wernberg, and the fourth in Krell. And you can see now that a lot of the characters become part of that little sub-genre, that little sub-component of the story. What about realism? These plots are a plot that would traditionally be called ZIF plots, and I don't know how many people have ever seen them before. They originated in the analysis of wealth and a study by a guy called Pareto, and so it's often referred to under the heading of the Pareto principle. And the idea is when you're analyzing wealth, that a small number of people control a large proportion of the wealth, and you see this very skewed distribution. So this is an extremely skewed distribution, as you can see, because it's got log x and y axes. What the Pareto principle would say, and we see this Pareto principle, this rich get richer idea, occurring when we look at, for instance, online social networks and mentions of people in online social networks. We see a few people mentioned very, very often. They're the influencers, and then a steady decline down to someone like me, who's probably got 3 followers out there. But actually, a lot of people are in that category of having a very small number of followers. And so that's the sort of distribution we're looking here. The top left corresponds, or the top left from my view, corresponds to the people who are really popular, and that tail down the mass, I wouldn't want to say unpopular, but not influencers. If we were going to have a strict Pareto principle, we would see that dashed line. Indeed, when you look at the real world, you often see that coming out very, very strongly. In large numbers of data sets, you see it being repeated again and again and again. So much that it's often thought of as a universal law that applies across a whole range of natural phenomena. So what do we see with Pratchett's books? Well, I've plotted the equivalent plots for those 5 books, and you notice they're not terribly good. They're not dreadful. They do show some evidence of this sloping line, But interestingly, the one that comes closest is making money. And I think this is really showing that as we progress through Pratchett's writing, he's building this world which is becoming more and more deep, more and more rich, and more real. What else can we look at? Well, another technique that's becoming really popular for looking at quantitatively looking at literature is called a narrative network. In this picture that I'm showing you, each circle corresponds to a character, and there's a line drawn between them if they're mentioned close together. So you then draw this picture, which I would call a network or sometimes a graph. The colors here correspond to the type of character, and the size corresponds to how often they're mentioned in the text. So this is the point in a talk typically where I would open the floor to the audience to guess which book this is and who those characters are, but unfortunately through this interface I don't think we can easily do that. So let me just add some labels there. And you can start to see what's going on. The obvious part of it is Two Flower and Rincewind in the middle. I think you probably guessed that this is again the color of magic. But there's some other sort of interesting structures in here. And again, you start to see the episodic structure. So over that right-hand chunk, you see Two Flower connected up to some of the Ankh-Morpork sites and people. On the upper side of it, you start to see Krull and the characters directly related to Krull. And on the sort of lower part and right, you see the Wormberg characters and locations. So it's another way of starting to understand the structure and relationships within a novel. Now, there's lots we could go into here, and unfortunately I'm really out of time. There's a vast array of mathematical models for networks based on real-world networks that people have been observing for decades. And one of the things that's really in my head to do is start to take these networks from Pratchett and compare them to some equivalent real-world networks and start to understand what's good and what's bad about his world in terms of realism. I think the world itself is brilliant, so I'm not trying to criticize it either way. Okay, so that's the end. Just to emphasize, I think there's a lot to be drawn out by these sort of techniques, but the thing I've been focusing on just recently is with these constructed worlds, what does it mean for them to be realistic, and is that an important facet of them for people to be interested in? So another project we just did very recently was looking at constructed languages, in particular Tolkien's Elvish, and trying to compare that to real world languages and see how realistic his creation was. So there's lots and lots more to come here. The other thing I want to emphasize is that what I want to do with this is create an open data set that everyone can use. I'm not quite sure how you do that in this sort of domain where there are copyright issues and so on with the books. And with that, I'll stop talking, or at least I'll start answering questions. Do you want me to just...
Oh, it's okay. No, I can moderate the questions for you, or unless you had anything else you wanted to add on the end of your wonderful talk.
I could say a lot more, but I'll let people ask questions. I think that's more fun.
Okay, no problem. Thank you again. I think the chat was popping off as you were talking. I think people were really mind blown by the graph and showed us. Someone asks, do you have any similar statistics for Tolkien's work? It might be a bit
yeah, so
specific.
But people have looked at the narrative networks in Tolkien. I have a colleague actually who's done a kind of graphic of The Hobbit, which has some similarities to the sort of plots I'm looking at here. So I don't think he's published that yet, but hopefully that will go out really soon. But I believe there are other people who've looked at narrative networks, particularly for Game of Thrones. There's some people who looked at, I think the search term to look for is network of thrones. Trying to think of the other ones. There's a couple others. People for a long time been using these sort of techniques to look at other sorts of literature. So I'm pretty sure there's a Hamlet graph as well. But one of the things I want to emphasize here, it's not just about pretty pictures. It's that picture of a network. I think people sometimes stop there. And so you see the network of thrones. They do this lovely picture. It's beautiful. It's really compelling. But then there's the question for me of what does that actually tell me? Is it just a pretty picture, or can I learn something deeper about the network or the literature from that?
Sure. Somebody else asks, where will the final data be posted? And do you have data for all the books? How do they change over time? So two-parter there.
So I have access digitally to the first 39 books. I'm still missing the last couple. But having the data and having it in a form that I feel like I can give out to people is another thing. So I have 5 books at the moment, which are pretty clean. They're nicely curated. I have a lot of the labeling to my satisfaction. The other ones require more work, and that will take some time. But one of the questions for me is how many people are going to get use out of this. So one of the things I might do is just post this stuff earlier and see whether or not a community of people actually really want to work with it. As to where I use GitHub a lot for posting data. So I will. I don't know how should we communicate with people after the workshop is over, because I won't be posting it tonight.
That is a very good question and safe answer.
Oh, I see James had said we have a mailing list, so I'll put it on the mailing list once I've got it ready.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Okay, there are loads of questions flooding in. Let's see. Oh gosh. Okay. Are sagas and mythology targeted more because of poetic patterns? Do you think repetition of phrases and so on for this kind of research?
I'm not directly involved in that, so I can't say completely. But I do know one guy who's just finished his thesis on Latin poetry and trying to identify the authors of each individual line in Latin poetry by looking at the meter, and that's very much about rhyme and not rhyme, but about rhythm and about how they use words. And so I think there is an element of that out there.
Thank you. And I'm going to pair another 2 questions together. Somebody asks, can you analyze an unknown book and find out if it is good and read-worthy? And the follow-up being, do you think that your work will lead to an AI writing good fantasy?
Okay, they're 2 tricky ones to pair together. I see why you do it though. The first one, yeah, absolutely. I think there is a lot of scope for trying to use AI to decide whether a book, not just whether it's good, but whether it's a book I would like. And we're not quite there yet. I mean, you see people trying to do that with recommended systems, and Amazon and Netflix, all those guys will recommend movies to you. And from my personal perspective, they do a pretty bad job. But I think it's a very foreseeably doable thing to be able to do that sort of analysis. It's much, much harder to do the other side of it, which is writing. And I view this as a forward problem and an inverse problem. And in mathematics, inverse problems are much, much harder. It's sort of like, the difference between enjoying a symphony and writing a symphony. It's just that different a task to be able to do one and the other. And they're related, obviously, but you can't expect to be able to do one because you've done the other.
Thank you. And just a quick question. What's the name of your gorgeous cat?
His name's Ninja.
People need to know.
He's obsessed with the computer with Zoom, with any sort of multimedia call or anything like that. He has to participate.
Of course, of course. He's a Pratchett fan too.
He is a Pratchett
Okay.
fan.
uh, Next question. How do you feel story impacts the way people build a vernacular understanding of things like algorithms? I guess a narrative more broadly.
Okay, so maybe I'm gonna try and redirect that a little bit to an even deeper thing, which is I guess many people have heard of the idea of a mathematical theorem and a mathematical proof that goes with that. And there's an understanding generally, I think, that a mathematical theorem is true. It's like an absolute truth, and the proof makes it so. The proof says all the things you need to say in order to absolutely establish that theorem. Actually, I don't think that's really how it is. A proof is really a story. And it's a story that mathematicians tell each other in order to provide a really, really, and I say really, really, really convincing argument that the theorem is true. But it's very rare that a theorem goes back to first principles and follows strict predicate logic to go from first principles all the way through. So in mathematics, actually, I think we tell each other stories as well. And those stories are the basis of mathematics. They're utterly important. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's really true.
That's a really interesting formulation actually. Okay, whizzing through. So sorry to be clipping up, but we've got so many great questions coming in. Somebody asks, I have a friend who's been doing some similar work, but focusing on mapping imaginary spaces. So far, the analysis has been mainly using Harry Potter, but she'd like to do Discworld. Did you look at all the interrelation between the different named places you identified when you were doing your research?
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't get a chance to show or would like to show, but it's a little bit nascent, is I've been working on the Discworld map. And what I want to do absolutely is place these locations in that space. And luckily, Terry and others built an atlas. And so a lot of this is given to us. But there's still some hoops for me to jump through to get that really nailed down. But I think that the structure of the spatial relationships is really cool. And one of the very small results that I've been able to show so far is if you look at, say, the distribution of land masses on our world, you can look. There's a few very big ones and a couple of medium-sized ones, Australia maybe, but then there's lots and lots of small ones. And if you look at the distribution of land masses on the Discworld, you see the same thing. And you see quite a lot of the same sorts of properties in that map that you have in the real world. So I think just quite a lot of very clever design went into that from people. I'm sure they didn't sit there and look at the statistics. I'm sure they just used their intuition, but it was very good intuition.
Great. Next question asks, I'm curious how sensible you think it would be to analyze these networks structurally, given that some characters are necessarily placed in the center of the network on the basis of plot, i.e. in real world networks, we can analyze to see who is important, quote unquote, in a network. And what might we learn from analysis of these narrative networks?
Yeah, so what the question really comes down to is the network I'm looking at is not the same as an online social network. An online social network is something that forms somewhat naturally, and it expresses natural relationships. Whereas this is an artificial construct. And so Rince, Wind and Two Flower, in the world of more popular people, they probably wouldn't have a super large number of friends on Facebook, and yet they're these central characters in this room. So I think that's a really valid point, and it's something that I think we need to tease out more as we go forward. I don't have a complete answer though, I'm afraid.
No, that's great. Thank you. Do you believe that such narrative networks would look noticeably different depending on genre, i.e. number of NER and connection, how often main characters are mentioned, etc.?
Yeah, I don't have evidence to back this up yet, but I really do think that, and this is one of the points about setting your story in a constructed world, is that in building that world and establishing it, you more naturally create characters and more relationships than perhaps you might see in a typical murder mystery. You
Mm,
know, it's been a long time since I've read Murder on the Orient Express, but there are 8 characters in that, or 10, or there's not that whole world around it. And,
Yeah, that's a really interesting point in terms of scale.
I think cross-genre comparisons actually is one of the places we want to go to. And I should say one of the other areas I'm really interested in is the superhero genre,
Mm,
and particularly the interrelationships in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
mm,
And another place where you see people doing world building, but the sort of networks you observe there are pretty different from us. They're not as rich. They tend to be more concentrated.
mm-hmm. Definitely. This is an interesting one. Someone asks, I wonder if it's reasonable to believe that we can resurrect, quote unquote, authors through machine learning, whether that's a good thing to do, as it's likely to be used to generate content as products rather than genuine stories, whatever that means. And what do you think about this possibility, Matt?
Look, I think, as I said, generating good stories, you can generate stories, but generating good stories is still a way off. But ultimately, we are going to get there, I think. And so this raises a lot of ethical questions of whether we can have the AI Terry Pratchett generating stories,
Mm,
and is that okay? I tend to get really scared by things like that. I don't like the thought of it too much, but we are going to have to think about those questions and try and, as a
mm,
society, decide what we want, and try and decide it before it happens. Because if we just let it happen,
mm,
someone will do it. Someone will build an AI and start writing AI
mm,
Terry Pratchett stories,
mm,
and we won't
mm,
have a choice.
mm. I wonder if just to sort of think on that, it reminds me of this sort of not panics, but sort of great furore that happened with digital actors. I think about must have been about maybe 10 years ago with when Pixar started doing its first sort of attempts at photorealistic actors
Yeah.
in films. And then you had it's sort of rotoscoping work being done, and there was a sort of claim that oh, idea circulating, oh, in a few years actors will be obsolete, and we computer generate them and so on and so forth, which has sort of happened as in one for instance, with Carrie Fisher at the end there. But even something like the uh, ebook not phenomenon, but thing when ebook.
Fake. So deep fakes are one of the
Yeah,
scary ends.
yes, that's
Um,
yeah for sure.
but there's a qualitative difference to me between something like a deep fake of Obama giving a
Mm,
speech.
mm,
Um, the really creative elements of that are still being done by people.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and the computer is just creating this image,
Mm,
as opposed to a computer actually writing
mm-hmm,
a novel or a screenplay or a composition. In fact, there's a large area of compositional, algorithmic composition in music, and it's used these days. So there are computers making music, and
mm-hmm,
you've probably heard some of it. It gets
mm-hmm.
used as lift music, and it gets used as the background music in computer games and things like that. So you've
Oh,
probably heard some of it, but you may not necessarily care for it that much.
right.
But these things are getting better and better and better.
Okay, that's creepy, but also good to know.
Yeah,
Well, not necessarily creepy. I mean, it's a
it is a little creepy. Yeah,
it's
it
it's a
is.
thing. Okay, we have 3 minutes left. So I'll just grab a couple more questions. Let's see. Someone makes an interesting point that I wonder if there's a difference between sole-authored projects such as the Discworld and a shared universe written by many people like the MCU, and just adding onto that too, things like retconning, revisions of canon, how that sort of complicates these sort of research attempts.
Yeah, I mean, I think there really is. The MCU again is really interesting because it's the tip of the iceberg of nearly 100 years of different writers creating content, and they've drawn from that vast literature into a small set of movies. So that's a really different sort of created world when you have that collaboration. It's easier because there's more hands, but it's harder because it's hard to keep consistency. You see that in comics all the time. They keep having to reboot, they keep having to have parallel worlds and to allow all of those visions to exist together. Whereas when you have the one artist working at the easel, he can make sure everything is consistent and he can keep that vision pure. So there are different pluses and minuses to those approaches, but I absolutely believe you'll see differences when you do the analysis and comparisons between them.
Great. Okay, and the very last question, which I just had, and it's disappeared. Okay, what could, as briefly as you're able to, I guess, given this is quite a big question, what could be some possible applications of kind of modeling with regards to translation?
Oh, translation. Okay. So natural language processing, one of its very large applications is in translation. And as you know, there are tools out there like Google Translate, which will take English and spit out German. As anyone who's looked at the output of those knows, it's not at all perfect. And I think there is a huge creative component in translation that's often neglected. I know we have a session on translation, or a few talks at least on translation later, so I don't want to jump the gun, but good translations are an art in themselves. And I think getting a computer to translate a work, like, The Color of Magic, is on a par to getting a computer to create a new work. They're similarly difficult tasks. But getting a translation that someone can read and understand what happened in the story, we can already do. It's just, why would you want to?
No, that's great, and I think that's a good little teaser, I think, for a future panel for this conference. We'll stop there. Thank you so much, Matt, for your really interesting talk, and thank you again, as always.
It's been one of the most fun talks I've done.